Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Linking Cultures, Connecting the Literatures of Southeast Asia. My name is Francesca Rendell-Short. I'm a professor of creative writing at RMIT and co-founder of Nonfiction Lab and RICE, which is the Writers' Immersion and Cultural Exchange. And I'm your host for this event this evening. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Wurrung and Burrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded land we are here today. I want to acknowledge First Nations' enduring connection with land, water, community, and culture, and acknowledge their literatures and the telling of stories for tens of thousands of years. I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to ancestors and elders, past and present, and any First Nations people who are joining us today. This event, Linking Cultures, presented by Nonfiction Lab at RMIT and RICE, is thrilled to partner with RMIT Culture. RMIT Culture unites the university's public cultural spaces, creative programs and cultural collections, as well as supporting RMIT's learning and teaching activities and sharing its research with our public audiences. And RMIT Culture offers a curated program in this beautiful space, the capital, which is where we are here tonight, dedicated to building a community of culture lovers. The conversation you'll hear tonight is an extension of the RICE program, which began in 2014, and it has brought together more than 80 writers from around the Asia-Pacific region, 3 of whom are here tonight. At the heart of RICE is the proposition that there is great value in creating spaces and opportunities for writers to connect and share ideas deeply with other writers from different cultures and across generations. And as I said, all 3 panellists tonight are involved in one way or another with the RICE program. So let me introduce them and welcome them here to the stage now. So from Jakarta in Indonesia, on the screen, we have Mikael Johani. Mikael is a poet, critic and translator based in Jakarta. His works have been published extensively internationally. His English translation of Gratiagusta's Shananya Rompas's poem, One by One the Bodies Died, won an honourable mention for the Hawker Prize for Southeast Asian Poetry. He is the author of We Are Nowhere and It's Wow. We Are Nowhere and It's Wow. And he's a RICE alumni from this year's residency in 2022. So welcome, Mikael. Thank you.
Yes.
So on stage, on my right here, next to Mikael, is Alvin Pang. He's a writer, poet, and editor from Singapore, whose work has been translated into more than 20 languages. In 2022, he was a Shivitella Raniera Fellow and Dublin Literary Award Judge. His recent books include Uninterrupted Time and Det som ge Osavara Nam. He has a PhD from RMIT and is an adjunct professor in writing and publishing and is a RICE alumni from the very first residency in 2014. So welcome, Alvin. Lily Rose Tope from the Philippines is a scholar who has published widely on Southeast Asian literature in English and Asian literature in translation. She is professorial lecturer and former head of English and comparative literature at the University of the Philippines. She has a PhD from the National University of Singapore and is author of in brackets, Framing Southeast Asia, Nationalism and the Post-Colonial Text in English in Singapore, Malaysia and the Philippines. Lily is a partner investigation on our RICE ARC Discovery Grant called Connecting Asia-Pacific Literary Cultures, Grounds, Encounter and Exchange. So please welcome Lily. So how this conversation will work tonight is that Mikael, Alvin and Lily will now converse and talk together about what it means to connect and exchange culture and story in this region. And there will be time for Q&A at the end, so please get your questions ready for that. So welcome everyone, and over to you, Lily, who I believe is going to kick it off. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I will begin the conversation with a very short introduction to Southeast Asia. When I was in Singapore, a friend sent me a Christmas card, and in the address she wrote, Singapore, China. So she thought that Singapore was in China. So I always begin with geography. Asia is divided rather strangely because we have an East Asia whose central culture is China. We have a South Asia whose central culture is India, and everything else in between is called Southeast Asia. There used to be West Asia, but it's now called the Middle East, and there has been absolutely no North Asia. So what we're looking at will be those countries in between by virtue of closeness and by virtue of history are now called Southeast Asia. Well, once upon a time, these Southeast Asian countries were composed of small kingdoms who used to trade with each other. They would go to each other's place. So, imagine it as a little neighborhood, and each one would go to each other's house to mingle, to eat, to trade. But when colonialism, the colonizers invaded Southeast Asia, all of a sudden, those houses closed its windows and forgot that they had neighbors. And depending on how long the colonialism was in each country, then that's also how long that these windows were closed. The Philippines and Indonesia were colonized the longest, 300 years or more. The rest of Southeast Asia by the British, perhaps by a century. And after the Second World War, these countries became independent, and they started opening their windows and rediscovered that they had neighbors. But they do not know their neighbors anymore. And slowly, these countries reconnected, first by politics and diplomacy, then by trade and security. However, our concern now is that the cultural connections have not been as fast as we would like it to be. So we are here today to discuss why this is so and what can be done to facilitate or to hasten the connections among the countries of Southeast Asia.
Okay, so this is where I take over. Now, I want to add to what Lily said by saying that Southeast Asia did not just trade and interact with one another. Before the 16th century, Southeast Asia was in some ways the pioneer of what we now call globalization. The ancient Romans knew about this, about us. Ptolemy had maps featuring Southeast Asia. China, India, the great civilizations of the past knew about us. Why was that? Because we were the Spice Islands. We were the source of many of the goods. There was a healthy trade back and forth between what we now call Europe and what we now call Southeast Asia. We were always the middleman at the crossroads in that trade, as well as a source of goods as well. And more recently, in the 13th to 15th, 16th centuries in particular, there was a very healthy trade. We call it the Maritime Silk Road. So you know about the Silk Road, where goods and silk from China would pass the desert, go through India, and go all the way to Europe. Marco Polo and all that. There was also a very healthy exchange of goods all along the coastal lines, going to Oman, East Asia, and so on. And therefore, when the eunuch emperor Zheng He, the famous eunuch emperor, brought his fleet of treasure ships from China all the way to East Africa, famously brought back a giraffe, he stopped along the major ports in Southeast Asia as well as in what is now called the Middle East, not because he was discovering these places. It's not a narrative of discovery. He was following very well-established routes of interaction, right? And re-establishing ties, showing off a little bit as well, of course. So what we're talking about is centuries, if not millennia, of very deep connections that was very abruptly broken by the European colonial and imperial entry into our waters. And it is an intervention that continues to this day. Like the Americans are most recently imposing this narrative of the Indo-Pacific. And I'm like, what the hell is the Indo-Pacific, We call ourselves Southeast Asia, the Asia-Pacific. Indo-Pacific is a very specific and very new kind of narrative. So I think Southeast Asia had a long history of exchange and interaction. It's a very syncretic region, taking its influences from different parts of the world. And you see this in the cuisine, in the fabrics, and I might argue the literatures as well. But it's also a region of great amnesia. We have, as Lily pointed out, forgotten that we once had this great connectivity. It's almost like our network protocols have changed, right? And we no longer know how to talk to one another. But I think there is great value in reconnecting. And I think with the internet, with events like this, with opportunities like RICE, we're learning slowly what it means to reconnect in the 21st century. And I want to add something perhaps provocative is I see Australia as in some ways part of Southeast Asia as well and part of the conversation. And I also want to think about the ways in which this community over here, adding its 20 to 25 million or so voices to the broader conversation that is Southeast Asia. Mikael, do you want to add your context as well?
I think I agree with you about the sort of long history of cultural exchanges between Southeast Asian countries, and I think it resulted in a sort of extensive, I think some people call it cosmopolitan intimacies between us, and it actually continued even after colonization, I think this book called Cities in Motion, I read about how gramophones are traded, from somehow the RCA Victor record company sells a lot of records in Rangoon, and it made the records made their way to Singapore and then Jakarta really fast, so we get all these jazz records in the 30s, sometimes sooner than countries in Europe, and I think the Cold War and decolonization sort of also put a stop to that, in the context of Indonesia, we had the Asia-Africa Conference in Bandung in 1995, and after that, we even established the Asia-Africa Writers Bureau in Colombo, and we try to maintain this cosmopolitan intimacies between what are now called the Global South countries. But because of the, people probably have heard about this, the 1965 massacres in Indonesia, where the leftist writers were killed or exiled, and the Asia-Africa project sort of stopped entirely. Indonesia became much more insular, and we look more inwards rather than, outwards. So, yeah, what can we do about that?
I think this segues nicely into one question I had for both of you. Indonesia is practically the size of the US, almost 300 million people. Philippines, of course, over 100 million people. You're probably the two largest nations in Southeast Asia. Massive. Mikael, you're saying insular. You have a large enough domestic culture and market to not need the rest of Southeast Asia in a sense. So I'm curious about how Indonesia and the Philippines regards the region and your place in it. Is Southeast Asia even in your consciousness or not? And if so, what is the place of Southeast Asia and Indonesia and the Philippines? And what is the place of Indonesia and the Philippines from a cultural point of view in Southeast Asia?
Okay, I'll answer first. Honestly, frankly, Southeast Asia is not very much in the imagination of the Philippines. The Philippine culture and especially Philippine education is geared towards America. So our school system, our educational system is patterned after that of the United States. And so the curriculum does not offer much in terms of Southeast Asian literature. But I think a decade ago, we tried to change this and introduce courses that include Southeast Asian literature. And I see in my students' eyes that they are looking at this text for the first time. They are discovering that they have a lot in common with their neighbors. They are discovering that, there are neighbors. And I think that will snowball later on into more interest in Southeast Asia. But of course, that is as far as education is concerned. There are more serious issues in publishing that prevents the importation of Southeast Asian books into the Philippines. So I think the reason why we are not reading each other is that the market is not efficient.
And you're talking about, obviously there are problems of translation as well, but you're talking about even the significant body of work that is in common languages like English or Bahasa and things like that. And yes, there is a lot of work being produced in Southeast Asia in languages like English as well as the other languages as well. But we don't necessarily know about that, and we don't necessarily know about each other's work. And even if we do, it can often be difficult to reach each other's markets. Yeah, Mikael.
It's funny to me that those cosmopolitan intimacies, I think, continued with other products of popular culture like music and films. Like with MTV in the 90s, Indonesians consume a lot of music from the Philippines, like Eraserheads. And films from Malaysia and Singapore, but somehow books not so much. Even though say the middle class, upper middle class Indonesians, so they can read English and they can a lot of them go to Singapore in the 80s to go shopping, but they don't buy books. If you talk about literature. Say in my experience, I don't think much about Southeast Asian literature until very recently. It was almost like by accident. I met these two Malaysian guys who were sort of invited to to a festival, a literary festival in Jakarta, but they were invited to the wrong thing, and I got really confused. So I thought what are you guys doing here? And so we hang out in Jakarta, and then I realized that hang on, I don't know anything about Malaysian literature, but they know so much about us, about Indonesia. Even our poets, like Hairil Anwar, there's taught in Malaysian primary and high school, and I think he's taught in Singapore as well. I had no idea. But if you asked me back then in 2015, one single contemporary Malaysian poet, I had no idea. So I think I've made it sort of my mission to find out more about Southeast Asian writers, and so that's how I finally met Singaporean writers, Singlet people, who've done a lot of legwork, I think, in reconnecting Southeast Asian writers. So kudos to you. Yeah.
Okay, I also want to share my experience as a Filipino scholar and a Filipino student studying in Singapore in the 90s. There was not much readings in our curriculum on Southeast Asia, so I had to go to Singapore to study this literature. And I am very, very thankful, grateful to translators like Harry Aveling, who's in the audience, for the works that have been translated from Bahasa. I'm also thankful and grateful to my friend Tony Lim, who is in the audience, whose family taught me Malaysian culture. But I don't think this experience can easily be replicated by an ordinary Filipino. It will take lots of media, both social and printed, to share the kind of experience that I had. And so I think that Southeast Asia is seen by the Filipino. Singapore, for example, only as a place for employment. Malaysia also as a place for employment. Indonesia is seen as a place for business. But the cultural exchange lags behind all these goals. And I think that should be remedied.
Yeah, I really want to speak to the point that the cultural exchange and literary exchange lags behind a really very healthy economic and diplomatic exchange between the nations of Southeast Asia. You're talking about over 600 million people. It's not a small chunk of the world's population, as it were. And we've been trading with one another, we've been exchanging, from an economic point of view, we continue to have very strong relations. If you notice those posters, digital posters outside, they're a living example of that. They were photographs from the royal press in Malacca, and you'll notice they feature, for example, packaging. Those date to the 60s, 70s, maybe earlier, where the packaging for basic goods, pharmaceuticals, liquor even, was multicultural, right? Or multilingual. You would have to have packaging in all the different languages because that was the market. The market was very much, cut across borders, cut across languages. And there was a feeling that you would cater to that. You would happily provide for the different markets that you have. It wasn't monolingual like it very often is right now. So that speaks to a time where there was a healthy exchange between cultures and between languages that I think kind of has died down in the contemporary era. And I think that it's a great pity. It's a great pity. We were a lot more willing to talk to one another, including on a literary level. But that seems to have taken a backstage to other concerns. I mean, part of it is the legacy of colonialism. I think there was, post-60s, 70s, there was a focus in general in many of our communities towards economic development, and cultural development, I think, took a back seat, and this is part of what was lost. But I think as we are coming up again in the world, emerging middle class, we are rediscovering not just stories and relations, but our need for stories and relations, and we're rediscovering these old ties. Mikael, what's your experience?
Yeah, I mean, even this event is kind of funny to me because the three of us, Southeast Asians, reconnecting, my disembodied voice reconnecting with you guys in Australia, and with the other 650 million Southeast Asians probably not even watching us doing the legwork. But things like this happens all the time, and I think I have a question, for both of you actually. Before we get started on the reconnecting, what do you guys think? What would be the best reason for us to actually reconnect? Why do we have to do it? What for? Do we have to, for the future?
Okay, from my point of view, the reconnection is necessary First, from the point of view of knowledge, we have to know each other. After all, we are neighbors. Much of the contentions that we experience come from our lack of knowledge of each other. So I'll give you a good example. In 1995, a Filipina maid was hanged in Singapore. This is Flor Contemplacion. And in Singapore, this was an ordinary thing. It merited only a very small portion in the newspaper. In the Philippines, the whole country was in uproar because the maids, the domestic helpers, they are considered as heroes by the country. And Singapore has no right to execute one of our heroes. So that kind of difference in mindset, that kind of difference in perspectives, is the differences are not known either to the Singaporeans or to the Filipinos. So woe unto the Singaporean who goes into Manila during that time, because that person will be lynched. So, but you know, the ordinary Singaporean didn't know this. And so that kind of ignorance of cultures, of perspectives, the ignorance of histories had caused this kind of issues, these controversies. And had we known more about each other, then this would have not occurred. The other example that I will give you would be the issue on Sabah, which is a part of Malaysia. The Philippines thinks that it belongs to it, but Malaysia, of course, thinks that it belongs to it. So a group of armed men led by a sultan goes to Sabah and tries to stage a coup. Of course, this doesn't push through. It was easily quelled by the Malaysian army. But such tragedies could be avoided had we known about each other or read about each other.
So I want to add to that. On the plane here from Singapore, I watched 3,000 Years of Longing, starring Tilda Swinton and Idris Elba, and it's based on an A.S. Biat short story. And there was a lovely line in there that struck me. And the line was, we ought to understand those who have a hold over our lives. We ought to understand those who have a hold over us in our lives. And I think that's the best reason, I think, for reconnecting with Southeast Asia. Like it or not, we are relatives. We are neighbors. We are an extended family. Our histories are intertwined. Our cultures are intertwined. The languages we speak, the food we eat, whether we remember or not, are intertwined. And unless we understand these connections deeply, others will manipulate us to their own ends, and we would forget the basis of where we come from and who we are. Two good examples, right? One is, just like you have your Flor Contemplacion thing, in this, I think it was the 60s, two Indonesian paramilitary figures bombed a building in Singapore. Today we might call them terrorists. It was a political act from back in the day. And they were caught and hanged in Singapore as terrorists. In Indonesia, I believe there are monuments to them. They're considered national heroes. Very recently, two warships in the Indonesian Navy were named after them, right? We don't talk about it. We just let it be, and there are reasons for that. But we ought to understand why that is a thing. Another example, which is more literary, a few years ago in 2013, I flew over to Singapore. I invited and flew over a group of Burmese poets and writers to Singapore to do a reading and so on. We had a packed audience, hundreds of people showed up, and we realized there was a deep interest in a community that's part of Southeast Asia, but because of their politics and the military regime had been cut off from us. And I remember being very moved when the writers, one of the Burmese writers said, we've waited for this reading for 50 years, right? And here's the thing, it turns out that some of the writers among them, had been working in Singapore for decades, right? including in the Singapore government, in various fields, in IT and so on. We had no idea we had some of the leading lights of contemporary Burmese poets working and living in Singapore. Again, we focus on the economic side of things. There are already relations, and on the cultural and literary side, we fall behind and we forget we had these relations. Similar experience when Crip and Jimmy and so on came to Singapore, and they realized some of their books which are out of print back home in Manila are actually in our National Library. Mikael, what about you? What do you think is a good reason to reconnect?
Funnily enough, I drive my daughter to school every day, passing the road that's named after the two Indonesian terrorists/heroes. I think the best. I think one of the best reasons, one of the best reasons that I think we should connect with each other is. I think that's sort of like a part of the bigger sort of struggle against the English-dominated international book market. My dream is, even though I love English, I write in English. But my dream is to get to know each other's literature, especially the ones that are not in English. And bypass English, I'd like to be able to read the Filipino novel in Indonesian translation rather than through English first, reading it in English and then imagining how would this sound in Tagalog. I think there would be, right now, say Penguin Southeast Asia has based itself in Singapore, but is it doing much for Southeast Asian literature, or is it just mining, Southeast Asian literature to be published and sold in the US and Australia, say? I think it already happens as well, say between Malaysia and Indonesia. I know that some Indonesian poets are published in Malaysia because our languages are sort of kind of the same, and Malaysian poetry scene, the readers there, they read Indonesian poetry, they like Indonesian poetry, they even write in an Indonesian style, which is weird to me, but good for us. We can just sell our books in Malaysia without having to be adjusted from Indonesian into Malay. I think that's one of the reasons that I believe it is to bypass all these gatekeepers, I guess, gatekeepers such that, we hear too much, but they exist. And rather than having to go through them, to go jump into the windows, the closed windows that Lily mentioned. Break it.
Yeah, I absolutely think we should read one another rather than wait for London or New York to tell us who to read or what to read. And I think there's something to be said about Southeast Asia. The one thing we do have that's common across Southeast Asia is we are multilingual, multicultural societies. I mean, all of us here speak more than one language and often use more than one language in our daily lives. As a default, right? I was once on a panel with the novelist, Pakistani novelist Kamila Shamsi, and she's saying that she faced this challenge when she writes in English, but increasingly has realized that even the novel as a literary form is reflecting the world and becoming increasingly globalized. It's becoming difficult and not impossible to stick to having only one language. She writes. Her novels include 5 languages. And I think we come from places where that is a fact of life. So even the way in which we write, even the way in which we use English, I always like to say, we've upgraded the language. We've taken it over and we've made it an Asian language. And our version, our use of the language in a literary sense is so much more nuanced and sophisticated. And we can learn from one another how to take the literature forward. And we can relate to one another when we you're all nodding because you kind of get what I'm saying. In a way that if we were to rely on the usual gatekeepers, as you're saying, they wouldn't get it. They're still on 3G, whereas we're doing 5G work, as I like to say. Lily, what do you think?
As an educator, it has always been my advocacy to bring Southeast Asia to my classroom. And one of the things that I have to admit would be that I photostat illegally some of the books that I bring home because these books are not available in the Philippines. So we throw the Intellectual Property Act in the bin, in the trash bin. But I think my sin is justified in the sense that when I look at my students' faces and see the kind of wonder, that is there when they read a Southeast Asian text and they say, oh, this sounds like me, or, oh, this sounds like home, then I think that justifies it. And I think also that education or the school system, especially the universities, play a very big role, should play a big role in spreading awareness of Southeast Asian literature especially. If these works, the works of our colleagues, can penetrate the curriculum, the syllabi of most of our teachers, then there will be more awareness of the writings of our neighbors. But anyway, I just want to share with you something that Mikael and I are doing. He sent me a poem based on a pop song written by a Filipino band. And in that song, in that poem, he used Bahasa, but he also used Filipino. I think that's a very good example of intertextuality. And my students will read it in English, in Bahasa, and Filipino. Never mind if they don't understand the Bahasa part. But the fact that they experience these languages in just one poem is already a kind of a breaking down of boundaries. And I think this is the way to go.
So it might be a nice time to bring in the Australian connection since we're here. And of course, it's multiple layers, right? First of all, there are the forgotten connections between the peoples of what is now called continental Asia and the long-standing ties you have with Southeast Asia, Torres Straits and the Flores Islands and Indonesia there, that are just waiting to be rediscovered and re-strengthened. And I believe RICE is doing something very soon to bring together writers from these different communities to talk about their work and so on. But more to the point, it is through RICE that we encountered and met one another. And it's through a program, oddly enough, founded here, initiated here in Australia, RMIT to be specific, through the good work of David Carling and Francesca Randall-Short, that we had a voice, we had a platform, we had an excuse for us to meet together and talk about these things. So this desire to once again connect, which was latent and very individual, was brought together, and I would like to think given voice, given a home, precisely because we had this chance to come together and to talk about this thing that we've all individually, privately felt a desire for, but haven't had a chance to come together. So it's become a very important forum for us to come together. And it's gotten me curious, right? What about the other way around? In what way does Southeast Asia feature in the Australian imagination and vice versa? How would we all like to speak together? And I don't know, maybe this is a good time to hear from the audience and see if anyone has any views at all. Would anyone like to share something? I think there's a mic running around.
Thank you very much for the conversation. I'd like to ask about your thoughts on, aside from the connections that you've been talking about, I think Southeast Asia also has this very strong tradition of speaking truth to power. So I'd like to know your thoughts about it. For example, it would be very nice, for example, if more Filipinos read Pramudia or the stories translated by Harry, and vice versa, because I think, especially in the politics in Southeast Asia today, I think modern day or present day Filipinos and Southeast Asians would learn a lot about how the different cultures spoke truth to power. Thank you.
Truth to power, speaking.
Okay. I agree with you absolutely. I think if many more Filipinos were to read works from Southeast Asia, and as I said earlier, I am indebted to Harry Aveling for my knowledge of the works in Bahasa, then we would be more, it would be easier to connect. It would be easier to understand each other, especially in terms of the concept of power. Is that what you were referring to? Yes. Because Indonesia, for example, would have a different idea of what power is. In the Philippines, it's both traditional and Western. And if we can kind of, see through each other, then it will be a good diplomatic tool for us to gain regional cooperation or regional peace.
Mikael, do you?
Yeah. I think one thing that's very important to remember is that, like, before these books like Pramudia's Guru Quartets were being translated, a lot of people have been speaking truth to power in Indonesia, say in my own country. So, like, don't wait until, like Alvin said, don't wait until all these books that speak truth to power get translated into English to read it, if we could. Which is kind of ironic because I actually read Pramudia for the first time in English because I went to school in Australia when I was young, and my uncle Max Lane actually translated Pramudia. So he was married to my auntie. So but yeah. So speaking truth to power it's I think like it's very, like, I mean, I don't know when that's going to happen, but I think, don't wait for the translation.
So I want to add and say you're absolutely right. And there is something about Southeast Asia that there's always been a subversive streak when it comes to power. And maybe it comes from being such a syncretic culture that has seen so many empires come and go over the centuries, right? We have a jaded almost understanding of how flags come and go, empires come and go. It might have something to do with the fact that we are very much an archipelago culture with a Thessalocratic understanding of what power means. It's never been easily centered. So we have a decentered idea of power. I say this not just because of the literature, where it's clearly evident, but other cultural forms as well. If you look at the shadow puppetry, for example, in the wayang kulit, and the way in which they tell and retell major narratives of power, but always in a subversive kind of way. Like, the Southeast Asian versions of the Ramayana are very different from the ones in India, for example. The way in which even, for example, East Asian and Chinese folk tales have been given a kind of twist, a very often subversive twist, very often sort of adopted as satire, political satire including. I think there are so many ways in which we've forgotten that we've built in these things into the way in which we interact, partly as a coping strategy, partly as a cultural strategy and creative strategy. And there is a lot to rediscover. And one of the reasons to reconnect is to remember we're no longer orphans of history. We are not. Perhaps we never were. We've been told we're orphans, and we're rediscovering our, for want of a better word, our birth families, right? The extended network of relations was always still there.
Yeah, and also I would like to share, in my studies, there was a particular point in history where Southeast Asia was ruled by strong men. So there was Marcos in the Philippines, there was Suharto in Indonesia, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, and Thailand was ruled by military, and the same with Burma or Myanmar. And what happened here was that literature was, not literature, but the narrative, the historical narrative was overtaken by the state narrative. And the only expression of resistance that is possible is through literature. And so all these countries would have traditions of resistance. And this, I think, should be shared in the region. This, I think, should be appreciated by people who have gone through similar experiences and learn, they should learn from each other. So the fact that there is a common thread running through the literatures of resistance in Southeast Asia is, I think, already a good sign of connection. Okay, but of course, readership remains limited.
Actually, a good example of that is contemporary Burmese poetry. Under the military regime, they had to adopt the techniques of conceptual poetry, language poetry, to escape the censors, because the censors couldn't understand that particular style of postmodernist poetry, and they used that as a way to put across important political messages and speak truth to power as well. So there's all this going on in a very dynamic, but also, let's face it, a very fraught region where the contemporary governments have inherited and then adopted and reproduced instruments of colonial power in order to continue their control over the communities. So a lot of what we're seeing today started, like anti-gay laws being a classic example, internal security detention without trial in many countries, like my own, were started out as colonial instruments, but they were continued and reproduced in the post-independent governments as instruments of power. So we're in a sense still learning, finding ways to come out of that particular era. And one of the instruments is precisely this amnesia. It's not by accident. It's a deliberate forgetting of these broader ties. Yeah.
Also, in some countries, to write means to die. Before I came here 4 days ago, a Filipino writer was killed by the military. Why? Because he's a writer. So that kind of reality, slaps you in the face. So if you're one of the writers who come from a state-controlled country. So writers from different countries who've gone through the same experience should be able to learn from each other. And also to recognize that in some places, writing is a kind of sacrifice. You put your life on the line if you want to write, especially if you expose the truth.
Another question over there. Thank you.
I would like to ask all of you, because you are poets. If you look at the culture, in particularly the haiku poems, you will see there's a Japanese structure, but when it comes to America, it becomes huge group. And I don't recognize it as a haiku, but they say that their haiku is one point. The second point is they went to Japan and become a monk because Marshall was a haiku monk. So I think the big culture, if you want to look at it and if you want to analyze it, you have to look at religion, because Buddhism is also about writing poems, and the monks write poems. And for example, like the Vietnamese one, there are different groups. It means they split it from Buddhists from China, and they also went there to learn and to translate it. And when they split into a Vietnamese group, they also have a Vietnamese language group. It means because the founder translated just like the Bible, then you cannot change it. But the communists came and they took over. Communists is another Buddhist group. So at the moment, many Vietnamese overseas now, they look at the question, the teaching of the founder. It means that the old Vietnamese here, they say that you cannot change it because this is the word of the founder. And the other one said that, but we don't understand, our children will not understand. So I think linking culture, you have to look at it, and especially not many books write about Buddhism culture, because it changed from India to China, and China dominated Vietnamese for 1,000 of years. At the moment, the communists also went there to learn about Buddhism and become a monk. And they went overseas. It means that still poems.
Thank you for that. Your comments put me in mind of the time when I visited the Buddhist library in Singapore, and I was very, very moved to realize that there's an entire section in the Buddhist library in Singapore dedicated to poetry. And there's a great tradition of poetry and poetic writing in Buddhism that at least in one small library in Singapore, there is a record of the range. And I'm hoping and I'm trusting that the libraries here in Melbourne and in Australia and perhaps in our countries as well have their own records of this. If not, there should be. So you're absolutely right. On the matter of the haiku, it's a really good opportunity for me to point out that I think for me, reconnecting in Southeast Asia is not just about looking to the past and remembering the past. It's also looking to the future as well and realizing that we're living cultures, we're growing cultures. We continue to innovate and to grow. And it is not just about rediscovering tradition. We're also deeply modern, postmodern cultures. And one manifestation of that in our literature, I love to teach a course, I've actually taught it here in Australia as well, about contemporary poetic forms, right? And our thinking is the sonnet came out of 15th, 16th century, Europe, because of a certain time and place. The haiku came out of a certain tradition, so on and so forth, the villanelle, the sestina, and so on. All these forms that are famous now and taught in our schools came from somewhere, started somewhere. Why can't we, therefore, invent new forms? And if enough people pick them up and use them and write them, then they will become the new sort of formal structures of the future. So in Singapore at least, and we extended it to Southeast Asia, we did exactly that. So we came up with a number of forms that now have entire sort of selections of writers practicing them. There are anthologies that have come out or celebrating these forms. You have the Liwuli, you have the Twin Cinema, you have the Panira, Parosa, and so on. And now it's gotten me very curious about whether similar experiments are taking place in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and so on. So not just recovering the past, but looking to the future and inventing new ways of producing work, creating work that will take us forward.
Yeah, talking about haiku, like haiku is huge in Indonesia, and like Alvin said, like a lot of Indonesian poets actually they like the syllabic rule, so they a lot of them have like created their own schools of like haiku-like poems. You know, like there's one called Sonian, which is instead of like what's the haiku rule, say 575 syllables. This poet who just passed away, but a week ago, he created this poem, just like 5, 3, and then 1 syllable, and it's like hugely popular on online.
What's the name of the form?
Sonian.
Sonian.
Yeah, taken from his name, Sony, and like it's huge. Like they published all these like writers published their own anthologies, and they're very active. You know. Even though you can't call them really mainstream, but they're massive. And apart from those, like a lot of contemporary Indonesian poets now, especially the ones that were multilingual, a lot of us now, like I guess a lot of us now work in code switch. You know, like like I did in that poem that I gave to Lily. We use like languages, not just the languages that we use every day, but the language that we consume from other countries. You know, so like we can like Google Translate some Filipinos and use it. You know, I mean, and if we do it, we don't do it correctly. It's okay, you know. Like we break it, and
it becomes a creative stimulus and force, right? And whether or not the Sonian becomes mainstream is a matter of whether we teach it in schools, right? Yeah, instead of the sonnet and the haiku.
Yeah, the haiku is not suitable for Filipino because Filipino is polysyllabic, whereas the haiku is, you know, character-based, so they don't go together. But there was a group that collected haikus in English, but in cell phones. So it's poetry in cell phones. And here we can see that a very, very traditional poetic form, changes shape, no? Because technology comes in and it becomes a product of technology. Of course, the Buddhism is gone, because the Philippines is Christian, but the poetic form remains experimental, and it's not just written down, it is now texted.
Thank you, Lily. I'm going to interrupt now, and we need to come to the end of this really fascinating conversation. There are so many questions that I've got, and I'm sure you all have as well. I want to thank Mikael, Alvin and Lily, and I'd love you to join me in thanking them all for being here and providing such a provocative and amazing conversation. I'm so glad you're on stage to do this, because often in unstructured places we don't get to the kind of the depth that we've been able to go to tonight because of this wonderful opportunity. So thank you to the three of you, and to RMIT Culture as well, and to the Capital and all the people that have made this possible. Join me in thanking them now.